My task today has not been to deliver your ordinary analysis of the specific implication or the numbers on the budget. It's, of course, a little too early to analyze the budget fully, but to look at the overall fiscal impact of the budget and how we can understand the direction that is given to the economy through the policies and approach that's taken in the budget. And that's what I hope to do. I only have 20 minutes. So I'm going to focus more on what I say than on the slides. There will be some slides that are there to illustrate, but let's try to keep the conversation, your attention directed at me, because I think in a 20-minute conversation, I'd rather do it with words rather than pictures or slides. To begin, when we talk about the fiscal impact of the budget, I think we are with the UMP government that has a strong belief in the market system and market economics. And so let me begin by just quoting Adam Smith when he argues the two distinct objectives. He says of a well-run economy is first to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for people, or more properly enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves, which is basically stimulating or ensuring income growth and economic growth. And secondly, he says, it is to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the upkeep of public services, which is the problem of managing public finances. Now, the problem for government all the time is that these two goals or necessities of good public finance management and ensuring income growth and revenue growth in the country are not necessarily convergent. They can pull you in two different directions. The clarity and insight on this problem was another revolution in economics that came with John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s, where he recognized that the market, simply left to itself, doesn't necessarily deliver the goods. That the market, to work properly and to achieve the economic outcomes that you want, often needs a little help from the government. And without that help, that the countries can get into serious difficulty, as the economies of the West got into with the great, what we now call the Great Depression, and also even in 2008 in the financial crisis. So Keynes's basic insight was that, running an economy is not simply, putting a framework in place and letting it run, but an act of constant vigilance and intervention. So if I were to it's not like driving or having a self-driving Tesla on an American highway. It is more like driving a Maruti in Sri Lankan roads at rush hour. You need to be adjusting that steering wheel all the time. You need to be recalibrating for the changed situation on the road and doing it in a dynamic, constant way if you're going to avoid gridlock for yourself or crashing into others on the road. So the economic management is not simply achieved in one budget statement or a set of policies that are announced in a budget and left to automatically conduct itself over the rest of the year. It is achieved through the constant vigilance and constant action and constant calibration of economic policies by the government on a regular basis. So I think that it's important to understand that this is really a dynamic task. We can't expect that the budget has done it and it's dusted and it's finished. But let me come back to the Keynesian problem, which is that ultimately, the two activities, we talk about consolidating public finance because we know we have a large amount of debt. We know that the cost of debt is high. I'll come back to that. Can be at odds with actually stimulating the economy to grow, because jobs depend on government expenditure, jobs depend on people getting their money into their hands, and the economy depends on the growth of jobs and the growth of income. If I were to give the context for the Sri Lankan problem, the reason that this problem is acute today in a way that it hasn't been in the past is simply because of the way that the debt portfolio of our country has changed. Ever since Sri Lanka reached a level of GDP that took it out of the poorest countries in the world, we moved from concessional debt to commercial debt. And that move began around 2005. So you can see the red bar emerges in 2005 and starts growing, and as a proportion of debt, our commercial debt, and not just non-concessional commercial debt, has been growing steadily over the years, all the way up to 2017. To give you a sense of how significant that growth is, let me share another slide with you that shows you that, in 2008, so 3 years down this path, in terms of international sovereign bonds and financial markets, they carry only 11% of our debt. The rest of the debt is bilateral and multilateral, and much of that is concessional. But by 2017, you can see that our commercial debt has risen to 54% of our total debt. Even if you take the Chinese Exim Bank out of this equation, it is over 48, and today 50% of our debt is commercial debt. So I think there's a misunderstanding when we think that the debt trap of the country is driven by loans to China. It is not. The debt trap of the country, or what we call the debt trap, or the fears of debt trap, are driven by the fact that we have expensive commercial debt, and we've had no choice but to shift debt from concessional bilateral debt to commercial debt, because the nature of our options have significantly changed. How do you then manage this debt in a way that it doesn't become unmanageable? Now, here is the big debate in economics. There are many who believe that the way to manage debt is to become more careful, to spend less. So the word consolidation is associated with the sense of austerity. We had this debate in Europe over Greece. Should we have austerity? And to what extent can austerity become the solution to getting out of the debt? And that's a natural idea, because the idea that if we can spend less, then we can get into debt less. And then we can have less difficulty financing our debt. There's something odd about the world of economics that Keynes noted, that austerity not only reduces debt, but can also reduce growth. And if growth is reduced, then even if debt is not growing very fast, relatively to the size of your economy, the level of debt tends to remain high. So measures of fiscal consolidation that impact or negatively impact growth are also problematic, just like fiscal engagement that overspends and is extravagant and has investments on things that are unproductive also creates a problem of debt. So fiscal management is a serious problem. You can look at a government that is extravagant, that is spending money on unproductive things, and quickly decide that you want to shift this government away from that behavior into behavior that is careful and not spending, and put in austerity measures that then have a negative impact on growth. It's very much like a man who tries to clamber up on one side of a donkey only to fall off the other. And in a sense, looking at the post-2015 Sri Lanka, you might wonder whether this is what's been going on. That the measures of fiscal consolidation, which had come into sharp focus, have they impacted growth negatively? So in short, it's neither extravagance or austerity that helps posterity, but it is our ability to be smart and strategic in the way that we channel government investment and the budget. The panel that comes after me will tell you that this is precisely the challenge that the government has taken on in this budget. Because it speaks not only of measures of consolidation and reducing public spending in certain areas, keeping the primary deficit positive, but it also speaks of empowerment and measures to increase employment and growth. And of course, the analysis then of the fiscal impact of the budget may also have to be on the analysis of how well these two activities of consolidating but stimulating the economy are being, that strategic middle is being navigated, not to fall off on one side of the donkey or to fall off on the other. And I think that is the discussion that we must also have as we move forward with today's debate. But let me talk a little bit about how we have managed it and why this is looking harder. One of the ways that we've managed debt in the past, and it's very clear, is by inflating away our local debt. So local debt has a high, significant interest rate, and inflation is a sort of a hidden tax that you can impose on your debtors in the local economy or the ones who own your debt. And high levels of inflation help us to bring down our debt to GDP. So you can see in this graph that when inflation is high, or by growing a lot, when GDP growth is high, we manage to reduce the total debt or the debt to the percentage of GDP. But one of the consolidation measures, and it is a sensible one that we have focused on post-2015, is to say, well, a lot of inflation is not very healthy for an economy. It creates significant difficulties in managing our interest rate, and reducing interest rate is important to stimulate growth and investment. And so there has been increasing focus on targeting or reducing inflation. But the moment you target and reduce inflation, you are not having this instrument available to inflate and reduce the debt that you gather locally. So that's one way that has happened. Of course, the second way it has happened is that some of the policies may have, in fact, impacted growth. Not only the policies, but the uncertainty about policies as well has had a significant impact on growth. So we have a double whammy there. We have low inflation, low growth, but actually we don't just have a double whammy, we have a triple whammy. Because not only have we not been able to manage the cost of local interest because we have run low inflation, we have not been able to manage the cost of foreign debt interest because we moved to commercial foreign borrowing. So what this shows you is that bilateral lending, or even China post-2012, before that China lent at higher rates, has been lending to Sri Lanka at 2%. I've got the numbers up to end of 2017 because the breakdown is not available for 2018 to do the calculation. But the weighted average cost of commercial borrowing is 6.29% and climbing. So in fact, the focus of the problem is that not simply that Sri Lanka has a high level of debt to GDP, but that level of debt to GDP that we have is also is felt much more stringently because the cost of that debt is very high. The UK has equivalent levels of debt to GDP. The US has equivalent levels of debt to GDP, but their cost of servicing debt is 1/3 or less, actually less than 1/3 of Sri Lanka's cost of servicing debt. And the cost of debt makes all the difference, which is why negative ratings internationally hurt the country much more than we understand. But this is a problem now that Sri Lanka is having to face that has no easy solutions. And I want to be clear that we mustn't imagine that there is a simple silver bullet that we can fire to solve the problem, because keeping a sustainable level of debt and keeping on economic growth is a very fine-tuning challenge. It's a Keynesian challenge at the highest levels. Now, if I just think about how we have managed that challenge in unsustainable ways in the past, what you notice from even post-2010 to 15, we managed growth and actually this is true from 1980s onwards, so it's unfair to blame 10 to 15, but I've done the analysis for 10 to 15. But it's pretty true, 2008, that there were two ways in which we stimulated growth. So we had Keynesian economics, but not necessarily in a sustainable or intelligent way. One is that we allowed the trade deficit to balloon. So when you analyze growth statistics, 2010 to 15, what you see is that we grew in cycles. We grew because retail import consumption goods grew by reduction of taxes, and taxes mostly on vehicles often created huge stimulus effects on imports. But reducing import taxes often allowed very large, more than overcompensating growth in retail consumption goods. So we consumed ourselves and reflected that as growth without investing and producing. And the second thing we did when the trade deficit got too high and we had to make corrections and adjustments is we grew by putting pressure on the fiscal deficit. So we did massive construction projects, which the government funded. So you found yourself moving from hurting the trade deficit or hurting the fiscal deficit and managing an unsustainable path to keeping growth going without doing the fundamental structural adjustments that were needed to make the economy more productive and to grow jobs. So we grew jobs by giving jobs in government, and we'll come to that later, instead of stimulating jobs in the private sector. So that unsustainable path wasn't working for Sri Lanka. But having gotten out of, so the question is, it's not good enough to stop doing something that doesn't work, which is pretty much what the government may have done post-2015. You've got to start doing the things that work. And that is what perhaps we have not seen enough of. I think people also don't, the second thing about debt that we may not understand fully is that there is a hidden interest to foreign debt. That gets capitalized. You might wonder, why is it that only 50% of our debt is foreign debt if the interest we pay on foreign debt is between 2% and 6 or 7%, when local debt is all above 9%. Now, if foreign debt is genuinely cheaper, we should certainly be borrowing 100% of our debt should come from foreign sources. But actually, the interest rate on foreign debt conceals a second interest rate that's built into foreign debt. That is the cost of depreciation. And we know that the Sri Lankan economy, the rupee, has to depreciate given the rest of our macroeconomic framework, high interest rates. The rupee is in a constant path of depreciation. The long-term average is about 4%. So depreciation is, in fact, the balance interest on foreign debt. So what we try to equalize is not the explicit foreign debt against the explicit local debt, but the explicit interest on the local debt against the explicit interest and depreciation expectation on foreign debt. That is what we must equalize on the margin. Now, what we do with that implicit interest, non-explicit interest on foreign debt, is we effectively capitalize it. So we don't actually pay it off as interest because the debt obligations keep increasing when the rupee depreciates, even if you are not borrowing a penny to finance your spending. Simply put, if you want to maintain debt at a particular level, today it's 84% debt to GDP ratio, then currently your GDP must grow at half the rate of depreciation just to sustain your debt levels without letting them rise above the current levels. Of course, I'm talking on nominal terms, so it's not that tough. So if you have a 4% depreciation, your GDP must grow, the first 4% of nominal growth of GDP, or first 2%, just goes to offset the increase in debt that happens through the capitalization of the implicit interest on the debt. Now, we had a close to 15% increase in depreciation last year, which is why we see a big jump in the debt numbers from 77 to 84%, because half of that depreciation gets fed back as implicit interest on foreign debt that is capitalized in our books. So much of this debate that we have about debt, who's responsible for the debt, is misinformed by not understanding the cost of foreign debt. The interest cost of debt is so high today that we've done the math to say that over 2/3 of all the borrowing by the current government since 2015 has gone in to financing only the interest, and the interest on borrowing to finance the interest of the debt that has historically existed in Sri Lanka up to 2014. So debt is growing, but debt is growing to finance significantly the interest cost of maintaining the debt that is already in the books. And this is why it is such a significant challenge for the country, and why the old system and the old methods of inflating away debt, doing unsustainable policies to sustain growth are not tenable right now. We are in a situation where the price of debt is high, and we must change the rules and the way the government functions if the country is not going to get onto a path that 10 years later brings it to become an international case of a country in a debt problem. Now, unfortunately, what happens with government budgets is that we have typically post-election cycles and pre-election cycles. And you can see it from the numbers itself on this side. Post-elections, we tighten our belts. So 2009 was a pre-election cycle. Enormous, government revenue fell. Government expenditure, barely kept up. There was extravagance. Post-election, we tightened the belts. We come to 2014 and 2015, both pre-election years, and we again run very high levels of expenditure, or we reduce revenue. So basically, we have managed our debt, we have managed budget cycles by saying, all bets are off when the election is around the corner. The government must survive, and the government has to spend to survive. And then let us solve the problem after the election is over. This is the typical way in which Sri Lankan governments have run their budgets. And there is a question mark, I think, that the panel must answer, whether this budget is a lot different in terms of that, and whether it is not indeed, in many ways, a pre-election budget. I will leave that to the conversation and the debate, right? Let me just skip ahead from this slide to another slide. The distribution of government expenditure, and this gives you a sense, on interest payments is so high today that the cost of interest is greater than the total cost of government salaries and pensions. But government salaries and pensions are more than 1/3 of total government expenditure. And in fact, the interest cost is more than between 1/3 to 40%. So added together, this gives very little fiscal space to do anything else. And the interest cost is so high, you can see that the revenue that we recover, the total revenue of the government, doesn't recover our expenditures once you put in the interest cost. So the primary balance coming to 97% means finally we had enough revenue without interest costs, right? But the moment you have to undertake interest payments, then the revenues of the government become not enough to meet expenditure. So let me shift from this problem in terms of how the government has dealt with these high costs to looking at the way and I've talked about consolidation versus stimulation and the problem of finding that strategic middle path of driving your Maruti on Sri Lankan roads. But the government has response to that strategic path is to talk about empowerment and protection. And to say that this is a budget that strides that middle path because it's being responsible in the way it's allocating finances by focusing on empowerment for jobs and economic growth, ideally, and protecting the vulnerable, which of course is a significant and fundamental responsibility of government, without which you're not going to get on a path of long-term productivity and growth, because if there is no education, no good health care, we don't bring that vulnerable population into higher levels of skills and higher level of productivity over time. Now, I think there are some very significantly valuable policies and ideas in the budget for empowerment, very specifically about bringing more women into the labor force and what the strategies are in that regard. We know that only 35% of the women living in Sri Lanka are in the Sri Lankan labor force. There is another percentage that is working outside the country and not working here. And part of the problem for women to get into the labor force seems to be around rigidities and problems in the labor market that make it far more efficient or sensible in a marriage relationship for the woman to specialize in looking after the productive activities that are needed to manage the home, rather than outsource them and get involved in productivity activities outside the home. And mainly because simple issues like childcare, flexibility in the workplace have not been properly instituted. It is creating a problem and we have another study on that, which I've presented elsewhere, and I won't repeat it. But I think the idea of identifying very concretely that there is an issue for women and looking at policies that can try to solve that problem is a step in the right direction. The budget doesn't solve it in a day, as I said. You must keep tweaking your policies every day, every month, every week to get them right and to make sure that the outcomes are delivered. But moving in that direction makes a lot of sense. If I'm going over time, somebody signal to me, and I will try and stop soon. I can't see a timekeeper, and I haven't looked at the watch. The second area in which the budget attempts to solve this problem is through loans for entrepreneurship. Now here, I think we have a more problematic strategy and approach, because it has been the dream of every policymaker that we can have the poor pull themselves up by their bootstraps by becoming entrepreneurs only if we give them a little extra money or extra funding. Entrepreneurship is not generated that way, and if entrepreneurship was generated that way, then our technical, vocational education system that has entrepreneurship courses actually gives money for entrepreneurs should be succeeding. They're not. The loan repayment scheme on the entrepreneurship loan system that is run by the Sri Lanka's vocational and technical education system is less than 50%, and even the loans that are taken are not really, even the loans that are being paid back are probably taken more for consumption than for any real business advancement. This is not just true of the current situation in the country, it is true all the way back from the Janasavya experiment. My undergraduate thesis was in analyzing the effectiveness of Janasavya, and what I realized was that it did put money into the pockets of the poor, but money that was mostly spent on upgrading their homes, their lifestyles, and not money that converted itself into entrepreneurship, because there is kind of a limit in society that not everybody is born to be an entrepreneur. And you businessmen who have succeeded know it best. If everybody could be an entrepreneur, you wouldn't be on the top of the pile. It is a special skill. Maybe about 10% of the people can convert extra money into entrepreneurship success. It is not a panacea or a solution for the problems of poverty. But what loan schemes like this do is it gets money flowing in the economy in a Keynesian stimulus. So we've had 3 negative shocks on our rural economy, right? We've had on one hand, we've had the end of the war and the reduction of fund transfers that are going into the rural sector through the military. Military recruitment was a huge part of our welfare system effectively in the country, because extra money in the hands of soldiers mostly found itself back to their homes and supported several families and created extra economy in the rural sector. Secondly, we had the government increase taxes and suck out money from the economy into government coffers, and that's excess consumption that came out of the system into government spending. And thirdly, we had floods and droughts that significantly reduced agriculture output and harvest in the rural economy. So there were three distinct events that sucked out the spending ability in the rural sector and in the economy in general. And what this kind of loan scheme can do is not actually what it's built to do, but put back the oxygen of cash into the rural economy, get people spending, and create a Keynesian stimulus effect if it is managed without too much fiscal fiscal kind of consequences for the economy. So I think that, and I think the entrepreneurship model needs to be looked at better. Some of the world's most important studies on how to lend to the poor are being done in Sri Lanka and published in the best economic journals in the world. I see discussions on it at Yale, in the top universities. They're done by academics in Peradeniya University. It's an international team from Oxford in the US, National Bureau of Economics, and Peradeniya. They've been carried out since 2005, post-tsunami it was started. And we have the best control trial and laboratory experiments today of anywhere in the world about how you can succeed in lending to the poor. Unfortunately, the way the public sector works and the public service works, these studies are not incorporated into the thinking or translation or the design of policy in our system, and therefore we don't benefit from that. Okay, so let me try and end. I think, let me say two more things and end then. In terms of how we can see a directional improvement in the way the budget solves the fiscal problem of the country and the economy. We know that 28% of our labor force work in agriculture, and they produce exactly or approximately 8% of GDP. It is the most unproductive sector in the country. It is optimistic at best to assume that all these people will suddenly, the farmers will boot up and become industrial workers or join the service sector. They can't and they won't. You can't get that transition fast. You have to have a productivity transformation in agriculture, without which you can't transform the economy. Now, there are some solutions in the budget for that. It's looking at the logistics of agriculture, storage, post-harvest issues. But the problem is deeper and needs sustained focal attention. Our agriculture extension system is not working. Our laws with regard to planting, the research that we input into making harvests better, the information that we give to avoid disasters, manage disasters with regard to agriculture, all these are broken. And the farmer pays the price and the economy pays the price. Let me end with one more thought. Taxation, because we talked a lot about taxation. One needs to be smart about how you tax, right? And given that we get a lot of discussion in our country about direct versus indirect tax, and the government sets itself goals about how much taxes should be direct and how much should be indirect. That is actually, I think, a conversation that has sort of got misdirected. We shouldn't really care about direct or indirect taxation. That's not the question. The reason we talk about direct and indirect taxation is because we think normally that direct taxation is progressive and indirect taxation is regressive. By the progressive and regressive, I mean that through direct taxation we can properly tax the rich more and the poor less. That indirect taxation, the burden of which falls more to the poor because the poor consume food items and things as a larger part of their budget and they save less. So really, it's not about direct and indirect taxation, but it's about progressive versus regressive taxation. And in that light, I think the government has taken some positive steps. So the taxation on luxury cars is actually a progressive taxation. So it is also a direct taxation in the books because it's taxing consumption, but it is the right kind of direct taxation because you're taxing vanity, essentially. And it's okay to tax vanity. That doesn't hurt the economy too much, and it does help a lot in terms of government revenue. So I think that we have to understand that and make that our metric. So we are taxing behaviors that are unproductive for the economy or even harmful for the economy, and then reducing taxes on behavior that is beneficial for the economy or stimulates the economy. And that is where the cigarette taxation also kicks in, and why it is so important to get it right, because it is more than 100 billion in revenue. So this thing about taxing behavior, economists talk about as elasticity. That is, you want to tax those things in which the consumer response to the tax is minimal, that when you increase taxes, consumption doesn't change too much, because then your revenue actually increases. So if when you increase the tax, the consumption doesn't drop, your revenue increases. But you don't want to tax everything that is non-elastic. For instance, then you can start taxing education and healthcare, but those are essentially productive and important things for the economy. So just because it's non-elastic, you don't tax. If it's non-elastic, and it is not very productive for the economy, that is where you focus your taxes. Luxury cars can be one of them, because the rich will always want to, vanity doesn't go away easily. It's pretty non-elastic, and you can tax it. So is addiction. We know that elasticity on cigarettes is 0.5. That is, if you increase taxes by 10%, revenue drops only 5%. Which is why when the government did the 40% tax increase in 2016, the revenue increase was 20%, increased by 18 billion. But since the 2016 October-November tax increase, we haven't increased taxation till now. We waited 2 years. And we've got it wrong again, because the elasticity is about substitution. So if you look at this graph, and I'll end with this, right, in one more thing, you notice that most of the consumers of cigarettes are consuming the most expensive brand at 55 rupees. But there is a view that has been adopted by the government that the threat to substitution is BD. But actually, the threat to substitution is not BD, because there are cigarettes at cheaper prices. There's a 20 rupee cigarette called Capstan, for which the government has not increased taxes at all this year, despite talking about increase in cigarette taxation. So if you increase the tax on the 55 rupee cigarette and drive up price, don't increase tax on the 20 rupee cigarette, where do you think the consumer is going to go? Not to BD, but to Capstan. And that is where the revenue leakage happens. Even if everybody having Capstan today went to BD, that's only 10% of the market, you couldn't care less, or not so much. I think BD prices must go up also. But by leaving this gap in price between Capstan and Gold Leaf, you get your tax all wrong. So all this to say, and forget about cigarette tax, the point I'm making is that you need a smart, analytically savvy bureaucracy if you're going to get policy right. Politicians can't do it. Politicians can't be expected to be economists. They can't be expected to do the math. They must be guided by what the bureaucracy says and gives them in terms of analysis, and they're not obviously getting the right analysis. And that is not just true for cigarette taxation, it's true across the board on many policies of the government. Iran Vikramaratne, I think, who's come on the panel today, is on record saying that if you had to pick one single reform for the government, it is public sector reform. We can't drive this economy on the public sector we have. It's like buying a BMW and putting in a Maruti engine on a Sri Lankan road even. That doesn't work. Right? So structurally speaking, we must transform agriculture. For sure, we must also transform the competence and ability of a bureaucracy that has to constantly drive and manage this path and road that we have ahead if the public finance, public management is going to succeed and deliver not just on debt management, but also on growth. Thank you very much.